There are moments in life that do not begin with shouting. No tears fall to the floor. No doors are slammed shut in anger. They begin very quietly. Just a man standing in the middle of a hospital corridor, under the cold glow of fluorescent lights, holding his daughter in his arms, listening as an announcement echoes from the speaker mounted on the ceiling, an announcement so brief that almost no one around pays attention to it. Code red. O-negative blood is needed immediately. Pediatric emergency. Daniel Carter froze. He didn't know why his heart was suddenly pounding so fast. Maybe it was the word pediatric. It could be the emotionless tone of the public address system. Or maybe, deeper than that, it was because he understood better than anyone what those two words, O-negative, really meant. It was the rarest blood type. And it was his blood type. His daughter, Sophie, gently tightened her arms around her father's collar. She was only 7 years old, thin, with brown hair hastily tied behind her head, and large, round eyes exactly like her mother's. "Daddy?" Her voice was small and clear, but there was something dire in the way she looked at him. "What's happening?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked down the long, endless corridor of Children's Medical Center Dallas, where the scent of disinfectant mingled with the smell of stale coffee from the waiting area, where unfamiliar families passed one another without knowing that just one more announcement could send someone's life in a different direction. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said after a few seconds. "The doctors are helping another little kid." Sophie nodded, but her eyes never left his face. "Does it hurt?" Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't know how to answer. At that moment, the door to the blood donation wing burst open at the end of the corridor. A woman stepped out, almost running. High heels struck rapidly against the linoleum floor, no longer carrying the cold, controlled rhythm she was known for, but the frantic steps of a mother in panic. Daniel recognized her instantly. Evelyn Monroe, CEO of Monroe Dynamics, one of the most powerful women in the city, the same woman who, just a few hours earlier, had left him standing frozen in the company lobby under the curious and uneasy gazes of dozens of employees. Their eyes met. In that moment, Daniel saw Evelyn Monroe's face drained of color, her flawless makeup no longer able to conceal the fear cracking beneath the surface. And what did she see? A janitor, a man in a gray uniform, a face she had once brushed past with a look of contempt. But this time, something was different, because she wasn't just looking at him. She was looking at the man who carried within him the very thing that could save her daughter's life. 6 hours earlier, Daniel Carter had woken up at 4 in the morning, like he did every day. No blaring alarm clock. No one needed to wake him. His body had grown accustomed to rising before the sun. He quietly stepped out of the narrow single bed pressed against the wall and glanced at the small bed beside it. Sophie was sleeping curled up, arms wrapped around her old, worn teddy bear, breathing evenly and peacefully. The kind of peace that makes adults feel relieved and afraid at the same time. Because Daniel knew that all it would take was one phone call from the hospital, one new medical bill, and that peace could shatter instantly. He brewed coffee, the cheap kind, bought in large bags, no sugar, no milk. Under the dim kitchen light, Daniel put on his light gray uniform. On his chest, his name was stitched in blue thread. D. Carter. Few people knew that before he wore this uniform, he wore dress shirts and ties. He had once sat in freezing, air-conditioned meeting rooms. He had once been called engineer, sir. He had graduated from Texas A&M. He had worked in precision mechanical engineering. He had owned a home, had insurance, and had plans for the future. Everything collapsed when Emily, his wife, was diagnosed with cancer. Daniel remembered vividly the day they heard the doctor say that word. Emily gripped his hand tightly, as if letting go would cause the entire world to fall apart. They sold the car. They sold the house. They drained their savings. Daniel took on extra jobs, night shifts, weekends. But cancer doesn't care about anyone's effort. Emily passed away on a rainy morning. Sophie was only 3 years old at the time. The little girl asked him in the stark white hospital room, "Where did Mommy go, Daddy?" Daniel had no answer. He only knew that from that day on, every decision in his life revolved around one single thing: how to keep Sophie safe. And so, he took a janitorial job at Monroe Dynamics. The pay wasn't high, but it was stable. Early hours, so he could pick Sophie up at 3 in the afternoon. He mopped floors in rooms where others talked about strategy, profits, and the future, things he once understood better than they did. But he didn't speak. He didn't explain. He didn't tell his story, because he didn't need pity. He only needed to work. That morning in the main lobby of Monroe Dynamics, Daniel pushed his cleaning cart toward the executive elevator area. He didn't see Evelyn Monroe approaching. He only heard her voice, cold, sharp, without hesitation. "What is this?" Daniel turned around. 3 feet, close enough to feel the contempt. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll move the cart right away." But she didn't stop. "This is your hiring standard now? Blocking executive access? Creating hazards? Careless?" Her voice echoed through the lobby. Daniel pulled the cart aside. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice did not. "I apologize for the inconvenience." Evelyn Monroe looked at him. For the first time, she truly looked. Then she turned away. Not another word. The marble floor remained spotless, but something had been crushed. Now, hours later, Daniel stood in a hospital, and fate, in its quiet way, placed him once again in front of that same woman. With one difference. This time, the power was no longer in her hands. And the actual question of this story is not who will be saved. It is who a person chooses to become, when no one is forcing them to be kind. Daniel did not leave the hospital immediately after Sophie's checkup. He stayed behind in the first-floor waiting area, sitting on a plastic chair by the glass wall where he could see the parking lot outside. Beyond the glass, the Dallas sky was pale gray, clouds drifting slowly as if they too were hesitating, unsure whether to move on or stand still. Sophie rested her head against her father's shoulder, turning the worn pages of a frayed picture book. She wasn't reading the words. She was only looking at the images. Yet her eyes kept darting toward the corridor where doctors and nurses hurried back and forth. Daniel noticed. Children have a strange intuition. They sense when the air around them grows heavy, even if they don't know why. He thought again about the earlier announcement. Code red, O negative, pediatric emergency. The words repeated in his mind like the steady beat of a drum. Daniel was used to pushing thoughts aside to keep living. His life had forced him to do that every single day. But this time was different. There was something in Sophie's eyes, in the way she had asked, "Does it hurt?" that made it impossible for him to pretend it had nothing to do with him. 20 minutes later, as Daniel lifted Sophie to stand and headed toward the corridor leading back to the examination area, a sudden commotion erupted near the emergency entrance. A gurney was rushed past, its wheels slamming against the floor with a harsh, jarring sound. Instinctively, Daniel pulled Sophie close to his chest and stepped aside. He caught only a brief glimpse, a small, motionless body, a pale face behind an oxygen mask, dark strands of hair damp with sweat clinging to the girl's forehead. A frantic voice rang out from the emergency team. "Female, 8 years old, internal bleeding, vitals dropping." A chill ran straight down Daniel's spine. 8 years old. Only 1 year older than Sophie. When the gurney disappeared behind the double doors, Daniel remained frozen. his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "Daddy," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "What happened to that girl?" Daniel knelt, set Sophie gently on the floor, and placed both hands on her shoulders. "The doctors will do everything they can," he said slowly, as if he needed to hear the words himself. "And Daddy believes they'll save her." Sophie nodded, but worry still filled her eyes. Daniel took her hand and led her forward. He tried to push away the image of that pale face, but it clung to him like a memory not yet fully formed. They hadn't gone far when a scream echoed from ahead. It wasn't the sharp cry of physical pain, but the shattered, panicked sound of someone who had lost control. Then came the clatter of metal hitting the floor. Daniel quickened his pace, instinct driving him toward the sound before reason could catch up. He turned into a side corridor, and the scene before him stopped him cold. A wheelchair lay tipped over. A nurse knelt on the floor, hands shaking as she tried to call for help on her radio. And right in front of Daniel, on the cold tiles, lay the same little girl from the gurney. She was seizing. Her small body convulsed in violent, uncontrollable waves. Her hospital gown had slipped aside, her tiny arm jerking so hard it tore the IV line free. The nurse looked up at Daniel, fear filling her eyes. "She panicked, pulled out the needle and tried to run," the nurse said, her voice breaking. "Her mother isn't here yet. I couldn't hold her." Daniel didn't hesitate. He guided Sophie against the wall and crouched at her eye level. "Stay right here. Don't move," he said, his voice low but firm. Sophie nodded, gripping her shirt tightly. Daniel dropped to his knees beside the seizing girl. Everything else faded away, the noise, the lights, the people around them. All that remained was the small body in front of him, desperately needing help. First aid knowledge from his years as an engineer, from safety trainings he had once thought excessive, surfaced with startling clarity. He gently rolled the girl onto her side and used his jacket to cushion her head from the floor. "Call a doctor, now," he said to the nurse, his tone decisive. He placed a steady hand on the girl's shoulder, stabilizing her, and spoke continuously, slowly and evenly, like a lifeline anchoring her to reality. "It's okay. You're safe now. I'm here." The seizure went on. Daniel counted silently, each second dragging by like a full minute. 30, 35, 40. His heartbeat seemed to synchronize with the violent tremors of her body. When the final convulsion finally eased, the small body relaxed, drenched in sweat. Blue eyes fluttered open, clouded with fear. She gasped for breath, her lips trembling. A small hand reached out and gripped Daniel's wrist with surprising strength. "Please," the girl whispered, her voice weak but clear. "Don't let me die. My mom hasn't arrived yet." The words struck Daniel without mercy. In that instant, he was no longer in a hospital corridor. He was back beside a hospital bed years ago, holding Emily's hand, listening to the steady machines, hearing her whisper promises he knew he could never keep. He saw 3-year-old Sophie standing silently, not understanding why her mother wasn't waking up. A familiar, piercing pain spread through his chest, but he didn't let it take over. He leaned closer so the girl could see his face clearly. "You're not going to die," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The medical team arrived seconds later, though to Daniel it felt like much longer. They quickly transferred the girl onto a new gurney, reconnected the IV, and checked her vitals. Daniel stepped back. Only now did his hands begin to shake. His jacket lay crumpled on the floor. Sophie ran over and wrapped her arms around his leg. "Daddy saved her," she said, her voice trembling with both fear and pride. Daniel bent down, lifted Sophie into his arms, and inhaled the familiar scent of her shampoo, as if reminding himself that she was still here, safe, in his arms. Somewhere in the hospital, a mother was screaming her child's name. Daniel didn't see Evelyn Monroe running through the corridor. He didn't see the moment she nearly collapsed outside the emergency room doors. He only knew that a child was fighting to live, and that a mother was facing the same terror he had once endured. As the medical team wheeled the gurney away, Daniel stood still, feeling both hollow and heavy at the same time. He didn't know why he had been there at that exact moment. He didn't know why everything had led him to this point. He knew only one thing with absolute clarity. From the moment the girl had grabbed his hand and begged to live, something had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. Daniel carried Sophie back to the waiting area, but his steps were slower than before. Something seemed to cling to him from the emergency corridor, a dull, lingering sensation, as if the invisible thread connecting him to that girl had not yet been severed. Sophie rested her head against her father's chest, unusually quiet. She didn't ask another question, only gripped the hem of his shirt tightly, as if afraid that if she let go, everything that had just happened would slip away. Daniel sat down on a chair against the wall and settled his daughter beside him. He gently brushed her hair, feeling her breathing gradually return to a steady rhythm. His own did not. His heart was still racing, his chest still heavy, as if he had just run a long distance. He looked around. A hospital in the late afternoon was a world of waiting. Some waited for test results. Some waited for news from the operating room. Some waited only for an answer clear enough to know whether they should hope or prepare for the worst. Daniel had known this world for a long time, from the years he spent walking through different hospital corridors with Emily. But today, that familiar feeling carried a different shade. It was no longer just a memory. It was the present. It was another child lying somewhere behind closed doors. Hurried footsteps echoed from the main corridor. Daniel looked up instinctively. A group of doctors moved quickly, exchanging short, urgent phrases. He couldn't hear everything, only fragments. Internal bleeding, OR, time-sensitive. Sophie looked up at him, her wide eyes even wider than usual. "Daddy," she whispered, "is she going to be okay?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked down at his shoes, old scuff marks dulled by the hospital's spotless floors. "I don't know," he said softly. "But I know the doctors are doing everything they can." Sophie nodded, as if accepting the answer, even though it offered no certainty. Daniel leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment. In his mind, images from the morning returned with uncomfortable clarity. The main lobby of Monroe Dynamics, light reflecting off the marble floors, the lingering scent of cleaning chemicals in the air. His cleaning cart stood slightly out of place, just a little, but enough to become an excuse. Evelyn Monroe's voice echoed in his memory, sharp and cold, like a clean cut. "Is this the hiring standard now?" He remembered the feeling clearly. Not anger, not quite shame. It was a bitter familiarity. The sense of being looked through, reduced to a job title, a uniform, an obstruction in someone else's path. Daniel had learned to endure moments like that. He learned to lower his head, apologize, and keep working. Not because he believed he deserved to be treated that way, but because he knew he had no room for resistance. He needed that job. He needed the stability it provided, fragile as it was. He needed it for Sophie. Everything else, self-respect, fairness, had to come second. At least, that was what he had told himself. A sudden cry sounded from somewhere down the hall, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was an adult's cry, hoarse and broken, nothing like a child's. Daniel opened his eyes. At the far end of the corridor, a woman was being supported by two nurses. She was bent forward, one hand covering her mouth, her shoulders shaking violently. Even without seeing her face clearly, Daniel knew exactly who it was. Evelyn Monroe. Not because of the expensive suit or the familiar blonde hair, but because of the unmistakable fear in her posture. The posture of a mother confronting the worst thing the human mind can imagine. Sophie saw her too. She tugged lightly at her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered. "She's crying." Daniel nodded. "Yes," he said. "Her child is probably in a lot of pain." Sophie was quiet for a moment, then asked a question that made Daniel stop to think. "If it were me, what would you do?" Daniel looked at his daughter. Her gaze was serious, not curious. He understood what Sophie was asking, even if she couldn't fully put it into words. He took a deep breath. "I would stay with you," he answered, "no matter what happens." Sophie nodded, as if that were the only answer that could exist. A nurse walked past and stopped in front of the wall-mounted electronic board. Daniel followed her gaze. A patient's name appeared with a small line beneath it. Emergency surgery, in progress. He didn't know the girl's name, but he knew the feeling of staring at cold words that represented an entire life hanging in suspension. Emily had once been beneath words like that. Daniel remembered standing in another corridor, clutching a cup of cold coffee, staring at an electronic board and telling himself that if he looked long enough, maybe the words would change. But they never changed in the way he hoped. "Daddy," Sophie said softly, pulling him back to the present. "If they need help, would you help?" The question came gently, as if the answer were obvious. Daniel looked at his daughter, then toward the corridor where Evelyn Monroe had disappeared. He didn't answer right away. He didn't say yes or no. Instead, he placed a hand over his chest, where his heart was still pounding. "If I can," he said slowly, "then I will." Sophie smiled, a small but confident smile, as if that answer had already been written somewhere inside her. Daniel didn't know that in just a few minutes, the entire hospital would be shaken by another announcement. He didn't know that the words "O negative" would be spoken again. This time, not as a general notice, but as a direct call. He didn't know that the moment of choice he had just talked about would soon no longer be hypothetical. But there was something he was beginning to understand, even if he couldn't yet name it. There are paths in life that, once you step onto them, you cannot turn back from and remain the same person. And as Sophie sat beside him, her small hand resting on his, Daniel understood that whatever was about to happen, he would not run from it. Not because he believed he was better than anyone else, but because there are moments when the right choice is the only one that allows you to keep looking your child in the eyes, without having to look away. Daniel was still sitting in the waiting area when the hospital's internal announcement system came on again. The familiar sound, flat, steady, emotionless. But this time it seemed to cut straight through the space and settle directly in his chest. Code red. O negative blood is needed immediately. Pediatric emergency. All compatible donors please report to the blood donation center. People around him reacted in different ways. Some looked up briefly, then went back to their phones. Some sighed softly. Some stood up, hesitated for a second, then sat back down. Most continued waiting as if the announcement belonged to another world, one that had nothing to do with them. Daniel did not. He stood up almost immediately before his thoughts had time to form into words. Sophie looked at him, eyes wide. "Daddy?" Daniel bent down and placed both hands on his daughter's shoulders. "I need to go do something," he said, his voice low but steady. "You stay here with me, okay?" Sophie nodded right away without asking anything else. There was something in the way she looked at him that made Daniel feel as though he had just been given permission, unspoken, but complete. He took Sophie's hand and led her, amid the sparse flow of people, toward the blood donation center on the lower floor. The donation center that day felt nothing like usual. There was no calm, routine atmosphere of scheduled donations, no light, casual conversations. Everything was tense, rushed, as if every passing second carried the weight of a life. Medical staff behind the intake desk continuously called names, checked records, and shook their heads at those who were not eligible. O negative. Too rare. Not enough. Not in time. The words surfaced in fragments, but together they painted a grim picture. Daniel stepped up to the counter, Sophie still gripping his hand. "I have O negative blood," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply a statement, like telling someone he had arrived on time for work. The coordinator looked up, her eyes sweeping quickly over his face, then pausing a little longer. "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone a mix of hope and caution. Daniel nodded. "I'm sure." She handed him a stack of forms. "We'll need to do a rapid screening, and the amount of blood required is quite large. It may exceed the standard donation limit." Daniel glanced down at the papers, then at Sophie. She stood still, her eyes never leaving him. "I understand," he said. "Do whatever you need to do." The screening process was fast, but not gentle. Blood pressure, blood sample, medical history. Daniel answered every question honestly. He didn't hide the exhaustion from working too much, or the sleepless nights spent worrying about his daughter. The coordinator studied the results, her brow tightening briefly, then relaxing. "You're a match," she said slowly. "Not just a match. Your blood has a scarce antigen combination. The compatibility rate is higher than normal." She hesitated before continuing. "That also means, if you agree, you could save the girl's life. But the risk to you will be higher. Dizziness, severe fatigue, possible fainting. You need to think carefully." Daniel didn't respond right away. In his mind appeared the image of the girl seizing on the corridor floor, blue eyes wide with terror, a small hand gripping his wrist. "Don't let me die." He heard the words again as clearly as if they had just been spoken. He thought of Emily, of all the times he had wished someone, anyone, could do just a little more for her. He thought of Sophie, that morning when she had woken up and asked if he would pick her up early today. Daniel took a deep breath. "I agree," he said. "Do what needs to be done." At that moment, the door at the back of the donation room flew open. A woman stumbled in, nearly losing her balance. Her carefully styled blonde hair was now disheveled. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her face held no trace of control. Evelyn Monroe. She scanned the room as if searching for something, anything to hold on to. "My daughter," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, can anyone help her?" The coordinator turned toward her, speaking quickly and clearly. "We found a compatible donor. Your daughter will receive blood." Evelyn exhaled sharply as if she had just been pulled back from underwater. And then she saw Daniel. The moment lasted less than a second, but it was long enough for both of them to recognize the cruel irony of fate. Daniel saw her expression change, from panic to shock, then settle into something he couldn't quite name. And Evelyn, what did she see? A man in a gray uniform. The man she had reprimanded. The man she had humiliated in front of others. The man now sitting there, holding donation forms, is ready to give up the most precious thing in his body to save her child. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Everything she had believed in, status, power, worth, suddenly lost its familiar order. Daniel didn't look at her for long. He turned back to Sophie and crouched to her eye level. "I'm going to lie down and rest for a bit," he said. Sit here and wait for me, okay? Sophie nodded, lips pressed tight, but she didn't cry. Promise you'll come back, she said. Daniel smiled. I promise. He stood and followed the medical staff into the donation room. The room was small, stark white, heavy with the smell of antiseptic. Daniel lay down on the narrow bed and rolled up his sleeve. The needle touched his skin. A brief sting, then it faded. Blood began to flow through the tube, dark red, steady. Daniel stared at the ceiling, at the square panels of lights aligned in neat rows. He felt his body slowly grow lighter, as if some of his strength were leaving him. Yet at the same time, another sensation took hold, heavier, deeper. A quiet certainty that he was precisely where he needed to be. Through the small window in the door, he saw Sophie sitting on a chair clutching her teddy bear, her eyes fixed on him. Beside her stood Evelyn Monroe, motionless. She was no longer the powerful CEO of a billion-dollar corporation. She was just a mother, watching someone else save her child, helpless and painfully grateful. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, not from dizziness, but because he needed to keep that image outside his mind. He wasn't doing this for Evelyn Monroe. He was doing it for a frightened child on an operating table. He was doing it for Sophie, who was learning how to see the world through her father's actions. And he was doing it because there are moments in life when the only way to keep living with yourself is to give, even when no one asks. As the blood continued to flow, exhaustion spread through Daniel's body, but within that exhaustion there was no regret. He thought of one simple, deeply human truth. If his daughter were lying there, he would hope that somewhere, someone would be willing to stand up, just as he had. And if this world could function even briefly through such a quiet exchange, one person giving so another might live, then perhaps, imperfect as it is still a world worth believing in. Daniel didn't know precisely how long he had been lying on the donation bed. Time in that white room did not move in the usual way. It wasn't measured by a clock or by footsteps in the hallway, but by the slowing of his heartbeat, by the growing heaviness in his arm, by the fatigue creeping in like a thin but persistent mist. The blood continued to flow steadily through the clear tubing, dark red and warm, leaving his body and going somewhere he could not see, to a place where another child lay on the fragile boundary between life and death. Daniel closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to stay alert in a different way. He focused on his breathing, on the sensation of his hand resting against the edge of the bed, on the memory of that morning when Sophie had complained about not wanting to wear her old jacket. Small things, ordinary things, but they anchored him when the dizziness began to rise. Are you okay? The technician's voice came from nearby, gentle, professional. Daniel opened his eyes and nodded slightly. I'm okay, he said, though his throat felt dry. She checked the monitor, then looked back at him as if weighing something. We've gone beyond the standard donation limit, she said. If you feel dizzy or nauseous, you need to tell us immediately. Daniel nodded again. He didn't want to play the hero or worry anyone. He just wanted this to be finished. Through the small window in the door, Daniel saw Sophie still sitting there. She wasn't playing with her teddy bear anymore and wasn't looking around the way she usually did. She sat upright, hands resting on her lap, eyes fixed on him. There was something in that gaze that made Daniel turn away for a moment. It wasn't just worry. It was absolute trust, the kind children place in their parents, without conditions or questions. He wondered when Sophie would fully understand what was happening, and when she did, whether she would see him differently. The thought made him feel warm and afraid at the same time. Being a role model in your child's eyes was a heavier responsibility than any job he had ever held. The outer door opened softly. Daniel didn't look, but he knew who was standing there. Not because of the sound of high heels. This time, they didn't strike sharply, didn't carry the sound of authority, but because the air in the room seemed to sink. Evelyn Monroe stood in the hallway, not stepping inside, only looking through the glass. She stood very straight, but her hands were clasped together, her knuckles pale. She said nothing. No apology, no pleading. Just watched. Daniel could feel her gaze even without turning around. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to keep this moment solely for himself and Sophie. But another part understood that sometimes allowing others to witness is itself a way of saying what needs no words. The blood bag gradually filled. The technician checked it once more, then smiled faintly. "Almost done," she said. "You did very well." Daniel didn't respond. He exhaled slowly, feeling the fatigue settle into a heavy mass inside him. When the needle was withdrawn, he felt a strange lightness, as if his body had lost something significant, yet at the same time had released an invisible burden. She placed gauze on his arm and pressed gently. "You'll need to sit and rest for a bit," she said. "Drink this." She handed him a cup of fruit juice. Daniel took it and sipped carefully. The sweetness spread through his mouth, pulling him back into the present. Sophie sprang to her feet when she saw him sit up. She ran to the door and pressed her face to the glass. Daniel smiled and raised his hand in a small wave, signaling that he was okay. Sophie waved back, her smile trembling but bright. Evelyn Monroe stepped back as if unwilling to intrude on that moment. Daniel noticed out of the corner of his eye. He didn't know what she was thinking, but he knew he hadn't done this to earn a change in her gaze. If anything had changed, that was hers to reckon with, not his. A short while later, the technician opened the door and allowed Sophie inside. The girl stepped in slowly, as if afraid of breaking the fragile atmosphere. "Does it hurt, Daddy?" Sophie asked softly. Daniel shook his head. "Just a little tired." She climbed onto the chair beside the bed and placed her teddy bear in his hands. "Bear will watch over you," she said solemnly. Daniel laughed quietly, a soft but genuine laugh. He hugged the bear to his chest, the familiar softness easing something inside him. Outside, things moved faster than Daniel expected. The blood bag was transferred immediately. There was no ceremony, no dramatic moment, just one action following another in a system designed to save lives. But Daniel knew that somewhere in the hospital, a doctor was opening that bag, connecting it to the small body of the girl. He imagined his blood flowing into another person, carrying oxygen, carrying time, carrying possibility. The thought made him shiver, not from fear, but from the strange realization that he could become part of someone else's life or death story. Evelyn Monroe was waiting in the hallway when Daniel was helped outside. She looked at him, then at Sophie, her eyes moving over the two of them as if trying to memorize every detail. "Thank you," she said at last. Just one word, no embellishment, no explanation, but her voice trembled slightly, enough for Daniel to know it wasn't a formality. He nodded, not answering right away. Sophie looked up at her, then at her father. "She's going to be okay, right?" the child asked innocently. Evelyn swallowed. "She will be," she said, as if saying it to herself. "Thanks to your dad." Sophie nodded, satisfied with that answer, and tightened her grip on Daniel's hand. Daniel felt the dizziness return when they sat back down in the waiting area. The world tilted slightly, then steadied again. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment. In his mind, there were no grand thoughts about morality or sacrifice. Only a simple question, repeating itself. If back then, when Emily needed it, someone had been able to do this for her, would the outcome have been different? He knew the answer. Kindness isn't always enough to change fate. but that didn't make it meaningless. Footsteps hurried past. A doctor stopped in front of Evelyn Monroe. Daniel didn't hear everything, only fragments. Transfusion started. Stable. Responding. Evelyn covered her face, her shoulders shaking. This time Daniel turned away, not because he didn't care, but because he knew that feeling too well. The moment when hope is handed back, fragile, but enough to make a person collapse with relief. Daniel opened his eyes and looked at Sophie. She was leaning against his shoulder, already growing sleepy. He wrapped his stronger arm around her, feeling her familiar warmth. Beneath the exhaustion settling over him, he felt a quiet peace, not because he had done something great, but because he knew he hadn't looked away. There are moments in life when you don't get to choose the circumstances, the person, or the timing. You only get to choose how you respond. And in that moment, Daniel had chosen the response he could live with. Day after day, each time Sophie looked at him and asked, "What did you do when you could help?" Daniel sat quietly on the extended bench by the glass wall, his body feeling as though it had traveled too far in too short a time. The fatigue didn't crash over him violently. Instead, it seeped in slowly, settling into every joint, every breath. The arm that had just donated blood was tightly bandaged, resting still on his thigh. Sophie had fallen asleep in his arms at some point, her breathing soft and steady, her face peaceful, as if the world were still moving according to its proper order. Daniel lowered his head to look at her, a familiar feeling settling into his chest, the feeling of someone who has done everything he could and now can only wait. The hospital at night carried a different weight, quieter, less hurried, but heavier somehow. Long corridors reflected the pale yellow lights, stretching everything out as if each footstep echoed longer than it should. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the steady hum of the ventilation system, the distant roll of gurney wheels, the murmured voices of nurses at the station. He thought of Emily, of the long nights he had spent sitting beside her hospital bed, another hospital, the same kind of light, the same mix of helplessness and fragile hope. Back then, he had prayed, not for a miracle, but simply for more time. Tonight, in some way, he had given someone else the very thing he had once longed for in desperation. Footsteps stopped in front of him. Daniel opened his eyes. Evelyn Monroe stood there. She no longer carried the frantic urgency of the afternoon, but neither did she wear her usual sharpness. She looked exhausted, as if she had lived through a night longer than the numbers on the clock could measure. Her hand tightened around the strap of her bag, then loosened again, hesitant. Daniel didn't stand up. He didn't turn away, either. He waited. "The doctor said the girl is stable." Evelyn spoke first, her voice hoarse from crying. "Your blood arrived in time." She paused, as if searching for the right words, then seemed to realize there were none. "I don't know what to say." Daniel nodded very slightly. "All that matters is that she's okay," he said. His voice was low and steady, carrying neither triumph nor resentment. Evelyn looked at him, her gaze lingering on the white bandage around his arm, then on Sophie sleeping peacefully. She took a deep breath, her lips trembling. "I hurt you," she said, more clearly this time. "This morning, in the company lobby, I treated you as if you were nothing." She lowered her head, a rare gesture for this woman. "I'm sorry." The moment stretched longer than she expected. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked down at Sophie and adjusted his hold so she could sleep more comfortably. In his mind surfaced the image of that morning, the cold voice, the contemptuous look, the familiar sensation of being diminished. The wound wasn't deep enough to be unbearable, but it was real, and it was. Still there. "I didn't do this for an apology," Daniel said at last. "And I didn't do it to prove anything. He looked up at Evelyn. I did it because she's a child. And because if it were my daughter, I would hope someone would do the same. Evelyn nodded faintly, tears spilling again. I know, she said. And that's exactly why I won't be able to forget. She fell silent for a moment, then continued, her voice softer. I'm used to seeing everything through titles, efficiency, and who holds what value to me. Today, I realized how much I've missed. Daniel didn't respond. He wasn't obligated to comfort her, nor was it his responsibility to ease her conscience. But in the woman standing before him, he saw something deeply human, real shame, not because a mistake had been exposed, but because a person had been misjudged. Is there anything you need? Evelyn asked after a pause. A ride home or anything at all? Daniel considered it. He thought of the old taxi he usually called, of the dizziness still lingering in his body. He thought of Sophie, of how she would wake up halfway home with questions. A ride would be good, he said, for my daughter. Evelyn nodded immediately, as if relieved to be able to do something concrete finally. I'll arrange it. When the car arrived, Evelyn opened the door herself and waited as Daniel secured Sophie inside. She watched the scene for a long moment, as if trying to imprint every detail into memory. You saved my daughter, she said as Daniel prepared to close the door. I will never forget that. Daniel paused and looked at her. Remember this, he said. Not because of me. Remember it, so that next time you see someone in a uniform like mine, you'll see who they are before you see what they do. Evelyn nodded, saying nothing more. The car pulled away, leaving Evelyn standing alone under the hospital lights. Daniel leaned his head back and closed his eyes. The exhaustion finally claimed him, not with anxiety, but with a rare sense of calm. He knew that tomorrow nothing would magically become easier. Bills would still arrive, work would still be hard, life as a single father wouldn't change overnight. But something had shifted, however slightly, not in his circumstances, but in how he saw himself. Across the city, in a polished boardroom the next morning, Evelyn Monroe sat before the board of directors with an unusually calm expression. She listened to questions about leaving a meeting, about the company's image, and about the responsibilities of a CEO. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't defend herself. Yesterday, my daughter almost died, she said evenly. And the man I humiliated that morning saved her. The room fell silent. We talk a lot about value, she continued. But I just learned that real value doesn't live in reports or titles. It lives in how we treat one another when no one is forcing us to. Daniel knew nothing of that meeting at the time. He was at home, laying Sophie down in bed, pulling the blanket up around her. She opened her eyes sleepily. Daddy, she murmured. Is she okay now? Daniel smiled. She's okay. Sophie nodded, as if that was all she needed to know, then drifted back to sleep. Daniel stood there for a long moment watching her, then turned away and turned off the light. In the darkness of the small room, Daniel felt something with absolute clarity. He had not become a hero. He had not become a symbol. He was simply a father who had done what his conscience allowed. And sometimes, it is those quiet choices that change the world, not loudly, not immediately, but deeply enough that nothing can ever return to the way it was before. The next morning, Daniel woke up later than usual, not because he wanted to sleep in, but because his body wouldn't allow otherwise. The fatigue from the night before was still there, nothing overwhelming, but persistent, like a quiet reminder that he had given more than what was normal. His donation arm still ached. His head felt slightly light when he sat up, but the first thing he did was walk over to Sophie's bed. She was sleeping soundly, one hand poking out from under the blanket, her face relaxed. Daniel stood there for a few seconds to make sure she was okay, to make sure that last night hadn't been a long, strange dream. Life forced him to keep moving. He brewed coffee, stronger this time, sat down at the small kitchen table and watched the morning light slip through the window. In his mind, images of the hospital, the donation room, and Evelyn Monroe's face were still there, but no longer as sharp as they had been the night before. Daniel didn't expect anything from what had happened. He had never allowed himself to believe that a single good act could immediately change one's circumstances. Experience had taught him otherwise. Kindness might save a moment, but it doesn't always save a life. He prepared himself to return to work, to continue mopping floors and taking out trash, to keep calculating every small expense so there would be enough for Sophie's follow-up appointments. His phone vibrated as he was tying Sophie's shoelaces, an unfamiliar number. Daniel hesitated for a second, then answered. "Mr. Carter," the voice on the other end said, professional but not cold. "I'm calling from Monroe Dynamics. The CEO would like to meet with you. Today, if possible." Daniel fell silent. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. He covered the receiver and smiled reassuringly at her, then spoke into the phone. "I'll come." When he hung up, he didn't feel the anxiety or nervousness he had expected. There was only a cautious curiosity, like standing in front of a door he wasn't sure he should open. The conference room on the upper floor of Monroe Dynamics was bright and quiet. Nothing like the noisy main lobby where he had once been humiliated, where every glance had passed over him as if he were invisible. Here, everything was carefully arranged, from the long wooden table to the leather chairs. Evelyn Monroe stood by the window, her back turned when Daniel entered. She turned around, her eyes meeting his. There was no air of authority, no urgency, just a woman who looked tired but composed. "Thank you for coming," she said. Daniel nodded and remained standing, waiting for her to continue. "I've been thinking a lot," Evelyn began. "Not only about my daughter, but about that morning, about the way I spoke to you." She paused, as if weighing each word. "I don't expect your forgiveness. I know some words can't be taken back." Daniel looked at her without expression. He hadn't come here for another apology. "But I can't pretend that everything can return to the way it was," she continued. "Not after I saw you lying on that donation bed. Not after I saw your daughter sitting there waiting for you as if it were the most natural thing in the world." Evelyn pulled out a chair and gestured for Daniel to sit. He did so carefully, a brief wave of dizziness rising and then settling again. "I built my career on measurement," she said. "Measuring efficiency, profit, replaceability. I believed that was the only way to survive in my position." She looked directly at Daniel. "But yesterday I realized I had been ignoring something that can't be measured. Dignity." Daniel didn't respond. He let her speak, let the words find their own way out. "I can't change what I did to you," Evelyn continued. "But I can change what I do from here on." She took a deep breath. "Monroe Dynamics has hundreds of employees like you. People who work quietly, support families, and deal with struggles that we, up here, rarely see." She paused, then said slowly, "I want to build a support program for single parents in the company. Health insurance, flexible hours, and emergency assistance when children get sick. And I want you to help me." Daniel was stunned. Not because the offer was grand, but because it came from a place he never expected. "Me?" he asked quietly. I'm not a manager. I don't have degrees in HR or policy. Evelyn nodded. I know, she said, but you have something we don't. You understand reality. You know what it feels like to choose between an extra shift and a doctor's appointment. You know what paperwork never fully captures. She looked at him, not with the eyes of a CEO now, but of someone asking to be trusted. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a real role. Paid. With a voice. Daniel was silent for a long time. In his mind, he saw Sophie sitting in the donation room, holding her old teddy bear, her patient eyes fixed on him. He thought of Emily, of how she used to say that the world could be harsh, but not unchangeable. He thought of the invisible co-workers he saw every early morning, people with stories no one ever asked about. I have one condition, Daniel said at last. Evelyn leaned forward. Tell me. This program has to be real, Daniel said. Not for image polishing. And when I say things you don't want to hear, you have to listen. Evelyn didn't hesitate. I agree, she said. The meeting ended not with a ceremonial handshake, but with a fragile yet genuine understanding. Daniel left the building feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because he had said what needed to be said. Heavier because he knew that if he accepted, the road ahead would not be easy. Changing a system is not as simple as donating blood once. It requires time, patience, and sometimes confrontation. But when he thought of Sophie, of her growing up in a world that might be just a little kinder, he knew he couldn't turn away. That evening, Daniel told Sophie a small part of the story, not about boardrooms or policies, but about being able to help other families. Sophie listened intently, then asked, So you'll help lots of kids like me, Daddy? Daniel smiled. I'll try, he said. Sophie nodded, satisfied. For her, that was enough. And for Daniel, in that moment, he realized that sometimes change doesn't begin with grand decisions, but with not turning away when the chance to stand up appears. The weeks that followed passed quietly, yet were filled with subtle movement. Daniel still went to work early every morning, still put on the same gray uniform, still pushed the familiar cleaning cart through the polished corridors of Monroe Dynamics. The difference was not outward, it was inside him. A different rhythm had taken hold, not vague anticipation, not excitement over an unexpected opportunity, but the feeling of someone who had stepped onto a new path, knowing there was no returning to the starting point, even if the road ahead was still undefined. Evelyn Monroe kept her word. She didn't rush to announce anything. There were no press conferences, no large banners. She began with small, private meetings, sometimes only 3 people in an empty conference room. Daniel was invited not as a guest of honor, but as someone expected to do real work. He sat with his hands on the table, listening to the familiar language of management, costs, risk, efficiency. And when it was his turn, he spoke in a different language. The language of mornings spent choosing between an extra shift and a doctor's appointment. The language of sleepless nights with a feverish child followed by work the next morning. The language of families living on the edge, where a single setback is enough to make everything collapse. At first, the room often fell silent after he spoke, not in opposition, but because those present had never heard such things said so plainly. Daniel didn't attack anyone. He didn't condemn the system. He told stories. And it was the calmness of his telling that made it difficult to look away. Evelyn sat across from him, back straight, taking notes. She didn't interrupt. At times, she would stop writing and look at Daniel for a long moment, as if learning a language she had never needed before. The program slowly took shape, not as a polished proposal, but like a hand-drawn map, dense with small notes. Health insurance was expanded in practical ways, not just on paper. Flexible hours ceased to be a rare privilege and became a respected option. An emergency support fund was created without the lengthy procedures that often cause people to give up before receiving help. Daniel asked for things that sounded simple, but everyone knew how difficult they were to implement within a system accustomed to operating the old way. At times, discussions grew tense. Some worried about precedent, others feared abuse. Daniel listened to everything, then spoke calmly. If we build everything on the fear of being taken advantage of, we'll miss the people who truly need to be trusted. The statement didn't resolve every objection, but it remained in the room, like a seed not yet sprouted. Outside the company, Daniel's life remained familiar. He picked Sophie up every afternoon, cooked simple dinners, checked homework, and then sat with her on the sofa watching an old show. Sophie asked him about the meetings and Ms. Evelyn with innocent curiosity. Daniel shared only what was necessary. "Daddy's helping some other families," he said. Sophie nodded as if it were obvious. "Like when you helped that girl at the hospital," she said. Daniel smiled. Sometimes the most complex things in life are understood most simply by children. One afternoon, as Daniel was leaving the temporary office Evelyn had arranged for him, his phone vibrated. A short message from Evelyn. "The program has been approved. No conditions." Daniel stopped in the hallway and read the line twice, not because he doubted it, but because he needed to be sure he wasn't mistaken. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. There was no cheering, no triumphant moment, just a quiet, heavy warmth, like setting down something you've been carrying on your shoulders for too long. The program was announced on a bright, gentle morning. The main lobby of Monroe Dynamics was arranged differently. There was no raised stage, no clear separation between leadership and employees. People stood together, suits beside work uniforms, familiar faces finally meeting one another's eyes. Daniel stood off to the side, not intending to step forward, but Evelyn found him. "You should be here," she said softly. "Not to be honored, but to be seen." When Evelyn spoke, her voice lacked its usual cold confidence. It was slower, deeper. She spoke of a lesson learned late, of re-examining what once seemed obvious. She didn't recount the hospital story in detail, but everyone sensed that something very real had happened. When she invited Daniel to say a few words, he hesitated. He wasn't used to standing before a crowd like this. But he stepped up and looked out at the waiting faces. "I'm not good at speeches," he began calmly. "I'm good at fixing broken things, machines, systems." A few people smiled. "Being a single parent is like that too," he continued. "Every day is a problem with no perfect solution. This program won't fix everything, but if it helps someone avoid choosing between a work shift and a doctor's appointment, then it's worth it." He paused and looked toward the back of the lobby where Sophie stood beside another employee, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "We can't promise we'll never be wrong, but we can promise not to turn away." After the announcement, Daniel received many thanks, not applause, but nods, glances that lingered a little longer. An older man shook his hand and said his daughter was a single mother. A young woman whispered that for the first time she felt the company saw her. Daniel listened without saying much. He knew this was only the beginning, and beginnings are always fragile. That afternoon, Daniel stopped by the hospital, not for an appointment, but because Sophie wanted to bring a small card. They stood outside the room where Grace was sitting up, her face healthier than before. Evelyn stood beside her daughter's bed and turned when she saw them. No one spoke for a few seconds. Sophie stepped forward and handed over the card covered in crookedly drawn flowers. "I drew it for you," she said. Grace smiled and took it. Daniel looked at the two children, and suddenly everything felt complete in the simplest way. As they left, Evelyn walked them into the hallway. You've done more than you realize, she said. Daniel shook his head. I just didn't turn away, he replied. They stood there for a moment, needing no more words. Some changes don't require declarations. They only need to be lived, day by day, until they become the new normal. 3 months later, on a quiet early winter afternoon, Daniel and Sophie sat in the familiar waiting room of the pediatric cardiology department at the hospital. Light slanted gently through the windows, casting a pale golden layer across the floor, making the blue plastic chairs feel less cold than usual. Sophie sat close to her father, her legs swinging in an uneven rhythm as she colored circles on a sheet of paper a nurse had given her. Daniel watched her, sensing a very ordinary rhythm of life unfolding, a rhythm he had nearly lost. The arm that had once donated blood no longer hurt. Only a faint mark at his wrist remained, reminding him that some things pass through the body but stay longer in memory. Across the room, Evelyn Monroe and her daughter Grace were waiting as well. Grace sat upright, hugging a pillow, her hair neatly tied back, her cheeks rosy as if she had never endured days spent fighting for her life. Evelyn sat beside her, one hand resting on her knee, occasionally leaning in to listen as Grace whispered something. There was no invisible distance between the two families now, just two parents, two children, waiting for words of reassurance. Stable. Continue monitoring. No complications. When spoken aloud, those words could feel far lighter than the weight people place upon them. Daniel and Evelyn exchanged a nod. No polite greetings were needed, no revisiting the past. Between them existed a quiet understanding, built from moments no one had deliberately created. Sophie looked up at Grace and smiled. Grace returned the smile with a shy tilt of her head. The two girls moved closer as if by unspoken agreement, spreading their drawing paper on the floor and trading colored pencils. Watching them, Daniel felt something inside him soften. He realized that the most important things often don't live in boardroom decisions, but in the way children see the world, without sorting, without labels. A name was called. The doctor invited families one by one. Daniel took Sophie's hand and followed the nurse, feeling an unexpected calm. The results were good, as always. Sophie's heart still required monitoring, but it was stable, nothing new to worry about. Daniel released a long breath, as if setting down an invisible backpack he had carried for years. When they returned to the waiting room, Evelyn stood up. "Coffee?" she asked gently. "There's a place downstairs. They make delicious hot chocolate." Sophie overheard, her eyes lighting up, nodding for her father. Daniel smiled. "Sure," he said. They sat by the cafe window as light snow began to fall, tiny white flakes clinging briefly to the glass before melting away. The two children claimed a table, heads bent over colored paper, whispering their own private conversations. Daniel and Evelyn sat across from each other, steam rising from their cups. No one rushed to speak. The silence wasn't awkward. It felt like a necessary pause after months of intensity. "The program is running," Evelyn said at last. "The first cases have been approved. I receive thank you emails every day." She didn't speak with pride. She spoke as if she were describing the weather. Daniel nodded. "That's good," he said. "But remember, the important thing isn't the emails, it's whether we can hold on to this when things get difficult." Evelyn met his gaze and nodded. "I know," she said. "And I'm learning how not to forget." Daniel took a sip of hot chocolate, the gentle sweetness spreading warmth through his throat. He thought of mornings still starting early, afternoons still spent picking Sophie up, and bills that still arrived on schedule. No miracle erased everything. But some changes had taken root, quietly, persistently. He no longer felt like someone standing on the margins, not because of a new title or advisory role, but because his voice had been heard and continued to be heard. Evelyn looked out the window. "I used to believe that if I stopped, everything would fall apart," she said softly. "But it turns out stopping was the only way to see what I was missing." Daniel thought of Emily, of all the times he had wished he'd stopped sooner, if only to hold her hand longer. "Stopping doesn't make us weaker," he said. "It just makes us more human." Grace looked up and called to her mother. "Mom, Lily says she wants to invite me to her birthday," she said excitedly. Sophie added seriously, "I'll draw a beautiful card." Evelyn laughed, a genuine laugh. "We'll arrange it," she said, looking at Daniel. He nodded. Some promises don't need terms. When they stood to leave the cafe, the snow had thickened. Daniel helped Sophie into her coat, pulling her hat down over her ears. Evelyn did the same for Grace. The two families stepped outside together, their breath forming thin clouds in the cold air. Daniel thought about the road ahead, not a path strewn with flowers, but one with slippery patches, requiring slower steps and firmer hands. Sophie tugged at her father's hand and whispered, "Daddy, I like it when everyone is together." Daniel crouched to her eye level. "So do I," he said. Then he looked at Evelyn, sharing the thought without words. She answered with a nod. In that moment, Daniel understood that renewal is not returning to where one began. It is learning to move forward with what has changed, keeping what matters, and letting go of what once made you smaller. He hadn't become someone else. He had become himself, clearer, steadier. And as snow continued to fall, the two families walked slowly, letting new footprints mark the white ground, not perfect, but deep enough to know they were walking together. At least from here. That afternoon came to a close very slowly, as if time itself understood there was no need to hurry anymore. Snow continued to fall steadily beyond the cafe windows, each fragile flake dissolving the moment it touched the ground, leaving behind minor wet marks before disappearing. Daniel stood by the door, watching Sophie and Grace take a few running steps along the sidewalk, giggling as their footprints appeared in the fresh snow. He didn't call Sophie back right away. He let the moment for a few more breaths, as a quiet way of remembering that some images don't need to be captured, because they remain in the heart for a very long time. Evelyn stood beside him, wrapped in a thick coat, hands tucked into her pockets, no longer carrying the posture of someone who must control everything. She watched the two children, her gaze softer than Daniel had ever seen it. "Thank you," she said very quietly, as if afraid of breaking the fragile atmosphere. Daniel turned to look at her, then looked ahead. "There's no need," he replied. "It's already past." Evelyn smiled sadly. "No," she said. "It isn't past. It stays. But maybe it stays in a better way." They parted in the parking lot. There was no ceremonial embrace, no grand promises. Just a slow nod, enough to understand that from now on, each would continue their own path, but neither would see the world through the same eyes again. Daniel opened the car door and secured Sophie in her seat. She turned back and waved to Grace. "I'll draw more pictures for you," Sophie said. Grace laughed and waved back. Daniel closed the door, took a deep breath of the cold air, and got into the driver's seat. On the drive home, Sophie drifted to sleep, her head resting against the window. Daniel drove slowly, leaving the radio off, letting the steady hum of the engine fill the space. He thought about the past few months, about a chain of events no one could have planned. If that morning he had arrived a little later, suppose the cleaning cart hadn't been slightly out of place. Suppose Sophie hadn't asked that simple question if he had chosen to turn away when he heard the cry for help. Life, he realized, doesn't change direction because of grand decisions, but because of minimal, very human choices. made in moments no one else witnesses. Their small apartment welcomed them with familiar quiet. Daniel carried Sophie inside, laid her on the bed, and carefully pulled the blanket over her. She stirred and opened her eyes sleepily. "Daddy," she whispered. "Today was nice." Daniel smiled and leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Yes," he said. "I feel that way too." Sophie closed her eyes and went back to sleep, carrying dreams Daniel would never know, but he hoped they would be gentler than the ones he had once taken. Daniel turned off the light in her room, stepped into the living area, and sat down on the old chair. Streetlight filtered through the window, casting interwoven patches of light and shadow across the floor. He sat there for a long time, doing nothing at all. No calculating, no planning, just being still with himself. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel the need to chase after something immediately. Not because life had become easier, but because he had rediscovered an inner anchor, a sense that no matter how the world moved, he knew who he was. Elsewhere in the city, Evelyn Monroe sat alone in her office, most of the lights turned off. Reports and familiar numbers lay spread across her desk, but she wasn't looking at them. She was looking at a small photograph beside her monitor. Grace, smiling, holding up a colorful drawing. Evelyn placed her hand on the photo and exhaled slowly. She thought about that morning, about the sound of her own voice in the company lobby, cold and sharp. She couldn't erase that memory, but she could allow it to become a marker, a boundary line between who she had been and whom she was becoming. In the days that followed, the support program for single parents continued to operate, not always smoothly. There were heated debates, difficult decisions, and moments of doubt. Daniel participated with the patience of someone accustomed to fixing things one detail at a time. He didn't expect perfection. He only hoped for honesty. And whenever he felt tired, he thought of Sophie, of other children who might not have to wait in clinic rooms with the same fear his daughter had once known. Time passed, neither faster nor slower. Life continued to present new problems, but one thing had changed quietly: the way people looked at one another. Glances in the company lobby lingered a little longer. Questions were asked more often. The words, "I understand," were no longer just polite phrases. Not everyone noticed the shift, but for Daniel, it was enough. One evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Daniel sat by the window, gazing at the distant city lights. He thought of Emily. If she were still here, perhaps she would smile in that familiar way and say that things eventually find their own path. Daniel closed his eyes and whispered a quiet, "Thank you." Not to fate, not to circumstance, but to the choice he had made when he could. Because after all, this story is not about a CEO or a janitor. It is not about redemption or celebrated generosity. It is a story about very ordinary people standing before extraordinary moments and choosing not to turn away. It reminds us that titles may determine where we stand in a building, but they do not determine our worth in a moment of life and death. And that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is not to claim something for themselves, but to quietly give when no one is forcing them to. If this story made you pause to reflect on how you see the people around you, then it has done what it was meant to do. Because life does not change through grand speeches, but through small choices repeated every day. The choice to be a little kinder, to look a little deeper, and to remember that behind every uniform, every title, there is always a human being doing their best to live. Thank you for staying until the final moments of this story. If it resonated with you, please press like to support us. Share it so the story can reach others, and leave a comment to let us know what you felt at the end. And if you'd like to continue walking with stories about people, choices, and small moments that can change an entire life, don't forget to subscribe to Deep Life Tales. Because here, we believe that being human, sometimes, matters more than any name we are given.